Hi, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the Communication Department at University of Washington Center for Communication Difference and Equity Health Equity Action Lab. We have a lot to share with you all today, so we're going to get started with a few remarks from CCDE Director Dr. Raylina Joseph. Dr. Joseph, you're muted. Thank you. Oh, you're still muted? Oh, no.
Okay. Take three. Hi, everybody. My name is Raylina Joseph, and I'm a professor in the Communication Department with Dr. Gonzalez, and I direct the Center for Communication Difference and Equity. And I'm just thrilled that we are launching under Dr. Gonzalez's incredible leadership, the Health Equity Action Lab. The CCDE began in 2015 as an activist space that has always been combined with research, community engagement, mentorship, teaching, curricular change and development. And our first project, the Interrupting Privilege Project began in 2016, and it's been our major project to date. And so today, here, May 2nd, 2023, is an important day because we are launching our second major project, the HEAL Lab. And I'm so excited to hear more from Dr. Gonzalez in conversation with Dr. Jody Early. So Dr. Carmen Gonzalez is an associate professor here in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington, Seattle. She's also an associate director of research for our Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity, and the program director of research translation for the Harborview Injury and Prevention Research Center. Her research and community engagement work is focused on health and digital equity. And today she will be in conversation with Dr. Jody Early. Dr. Early is a professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell, and she is one of our CCDE faculty affiliates. Her work is rooted in principles of community-based participatory research, transnational feminism, and health justice. So excited to hear you all in conversation. So I'm going to bump it back over to Dr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. So before we get started, we just wanted to share a little bit about our goals for the lab and this live stream roundtable series. We want to bring folks together who do community-based health equity work, but also have this virtual space to support and promote that work, to reflect on what we do together in collaboration with community partners. So this will be a much bigger space coming soon, and we're working on developing all of the different components for the lab. So today we're going to talk about community-based research in the context of health and reflect on some of the practices that both Dr. Early and I engage with as we do this work. So Jody, would you mind telling us a little bit more about yourself and your research?
Sure. First, I want to just say thank you so much for inviting me to this launch. It's so exciting that you're launching this Health Equity Action Lab. It's going to create a space, I think, for really important dialogues. And so thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm a professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies at the UW Bothell campus. And my background is really interdisciplinary. So it's a mix of humanities, education, communication, and public health. And just a little bit about my positionality in terms of the things that we're talking about today. I'm first generation. I'm a cis white woman of mixed heritage of European and Latino roots. And I was born in Hidalgo County, Texas, Del Rio to be exact. But I really think of myself in terms of my role and my identity first as a mom of two, as a partner, wife to my husband, but also as a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister to 17. That's with blended families and on both sides, and an auntie to more than 50. I stopped counting after 50, and I think some of those are also great nieces and nephews. Before academia, I worked in education and public health, and primarily in community health with a focus on health education and health equity. I've served as program directors for not only academic programs, but also some of the community programs that I've helped to co-develop. And my work really focuses not only on improving health and health systems through education, but also on the importance of community co-design and engagement. My research topics really have spanned over the years, from everything from breast cancer to diabetes, HIV/AIDS, gender-based violence, mental health, and digital equity.
Thank you for being in conversation with me today. I'm excited. How about we start by posing a question for all of us to explore together, and that is, what does health equity mean to you?
So I think that equity it's different than equality. Equality is treating everyone the same, but equity means that we account for imbalanced social systems and acknowledge and address the historical and systemic inequalities and injustices that have created unequal starting points for different groups of people. And so to achieve equity, it really requires that we actively dismantle the policies and the systems that continue to perpetuate inequity, so that we can have equal opportunities, fairness, and resources for all. This graphic here, and I've adapted it, if you Google, you could probably find a lot of different iterations, but I've changed it up a little bit today and just want to thank the artist Angus McGuire for this. But equality, as the first graphic shows, it's everyone here is you can't see over the fence. We're starting in the same place. It doesn't account for, in terms of equity, understanding that people, because of the systems, are starting a different place. They don't have equal advantages or resources. But I want to take it a step further because, as I looked at those two, equality and equity, I often wondered, like, why the fence was even there. Why are we standing behind a fence? Why can't everybody why is there a fence there? What's the barrier? So justice is really symbolizes, by taking down the fence, that you're just dismantling those barriers and access to those resources. And the last one, to me, really is kind of the ideal. It's not having those barriers in place. We fix the systems, but everybody's in the game. Everybody's playing. Everybody has those opportunities. So yeah, that's, I think it's important that when we talk about equity, we're also talking about justice.
Definitely. So the way that I kind of think about health equity work specifically, it's also about meeting folks where they are, right? So thinking about not necessarily only academic investments or intentions or goals, but trying to produce actionable change. And to move away from deficit-oriented perspectives that are often traditionally in research and scholarship, right? One helpful framing is the social ecological model, which I know that both of us, it has informed both of our research agendas. And I like that it doesn't place the burden of health equity on only individuals, and instead acknowledges that health and well-being are impacted at so many levels. Jody, can you tell us a little bit more about how you understand and engage the social ecological model in your health equity work?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, acknowledging that we have to look at the root causes and the forces that are shaping, in my case, how's that shaping that not only the health of the individual, but also in terms of community and population health. And so the socio-ecological model as depicted here really allows us to go from that micro level all the way up to policy and macro levels, and examining what those issues are. And we can't really keep, years ago, health promotion really centered on just the individual and the individual behavior. We know that's an incomplete picture, and it's not effective. So we really need a more holistic approach. And so I use this a lot in the work that I do in health promotion and community health.
Thank you. I think that will be really helpful for folks in the audience, especially to kind of look back and think about some of these frameworks. I also want to talk a little bit more personally about what might inspire folks to do community-based health equity work, both in academia and in practice. For me, it started really young, I would say. I remember things like translating for my parents during medical visits, and thinking about the limited access to health resources in my community, or the health disparities that would always impact different kind of vulnerable populations. And that made me really impatient and frustrated as a researcher, wanting to do something about it. So I really feel that my research focus on health and technology is helping to make some little difference in the world as best I can. What motivates you, Jody, to do this type of work?
I think we are very similar in this regard. I think my own experience growing up in poverty and raised primarily by a single mom, and community was such an important part of our lives. And through generosity of community, at one point we were homeless. So I grew up experiencing those things. And also, I will say that it was education, and it was teachers and the mentors that I had in my life that really opened those doors for me and served as models. And I think that sparked within me a desire to not only teach, but to give back. And it's that community, that importance, that's really, I think, shaped the work that I do and research. And in terms of just, I think my research definitely has evolved since grad school, which was very post-positivist in the early years and quantitative. But it was, growing up and seeing during the time of HIV/AIDS, when it was first came onto the scene, which dates me, I know, but being troubled and inspired by the activism, in terms of troubled by the fact that I was actually being able to see how systems of oppression really impede people, not just from thriving, but literally surviving. And so it really created within me a sense of wanting to create those changes at the systems level. And also during my doctoral studies, I was introduced to, and inspired by who I was reading. So thought leaders and activists and advocates like Audre Lorde, Paulo Freire, Angela Davis, Patricia Hill Collins, Gloria Anzulia. This was the place where I was first introduced to not only feminist and critical theory, but transnational and Black feminism, which I really think shaped the paradigm for how I view the world today and the work and how I do the work that I do. And I also just want to say also, I was inspired by my doctoral mentors, that I was lucky enough to be at an institution that was primarily women, one of the most diverse in the United States. And they were the ones that were doing this community engaged work. So they kind of paved the way for me. And I didn't realize until after I left that it was really not the norm in academia.
Yeah. I was similar in the position of being very blessed, I would say, and privileged to have the space to do engaged work as a graduate student. So I had the most brilliant and really radical at the time advisor, Dr. Sandra Barrow-Keech, who in the field of communication was doing engaged work much earlier than a lot of folks, and thinking about that bridge from research to practice. And she even developed a course, a graduate seminar on community-based research that has inspired my seminar here at UW. But without that space and that welcoming sense of you can do engaged work as a graduate student, you can have these investments and commitments to community in addition to being successful in your academic career. If I didn't see an example of that or have that space in grad school, I don't know that I would be here today. So very grateful for her and all of my colleagues who we were all trained to be socially responsive social scientists. So there's so many ways that we can think about community-based work and so many different ways to do it, right, Jody? Let's explore this second big question together. What does community engagement mean to you?
I think everything really, all change really starts at community. So it builds from the grassroots. So to me, community engagement means centering communities as drivers of change and collaborating together, or collaborating, not to be redundant, but to achieve the change that we collectively aspire to achieve. So when I think of community engagement, what comes to mind to me is that phrase that nothing for us without us, which has its roots in the disability rights activism. And it's been adopted by a range of social justice movements. But community engagement means that people that are most impacted by the systems of inequity and injustice play key leadership roles in helping to create that positive change that we're striving for. And there's also different levels of community engagement. And so I really like this model that was developed from researchers from the University of Michigan. It's a continuum of community engagement and research. So you could look at this and think about your own work and how it fits within this continuum of no community involvement to maybe some informants within the community, to maybe consolation, but all the way to the other side of those questions actually being driven by community and community-based participatory research. You can see where it's really fits within this continuum. So I really like the visual on this to just show that there's a lot of different points along this continuum in terms of engagement.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that flexibility in the continuum is really important, especially for students who might be overwhelmed. Health equity research on its own can be really complex and overwhelming. especially without knowing for sure the impact right away. So having different entry points for students and researchers in general to know that not necessarily every project that you engage on is going to be super collaborative or is going to start in community from the beginning. But if you're honest and accountable to your community partners, then that work will thrive and it will have impact and it will be valuable somewhere. So I think that continuum idea is super valuable. So speaking of accountability, Jody, what other kinds of principles or values would you say ground this type of work?
Yeah, well, I want to credit Nina Wallerstein and Barbara Israel and Meredith Minkler for where I've come to better understand these principles. But, you know, it really goes back to first starting with respect, respect for everyone involved, but also trust. Really building and establishing trust is key to any of this work, and sometimes that can take a long time. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about later as we go along, is just the time that's involved in this work. But also collaboration. So everybody's coming to this table with wisdom and with talents and with knowledge, and so it really does kind of throw that hierarchical model of traditional research. It upends it because everyone is coming with that power. And also cultural humility is important, to have that continual reflection of where am I in this work, and what can I learn, and being open and listening. And then of course equity, the power dynamics are just going to be there. So figuring out how you can rebalance or try to balance more of that. And then I think a key piece of this is also sustainability. So what's going to happen? What comes next? Am I just doing this for a project? That's going to cause a lot of harm. So thinking about, how does this work continue?
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned time. I think that especially working with students who are trying to do this for, let's say, a class project or a thesis or dissertation project, sometimes our conceptions of time as academics don't translate into different settings, right? So the limitations of a quarter system or a school year don't often translate to benefits for communities depending on their needs and urgencies. So flexibility is such an important underscore to all of this type of work. And then just that time invested in building rapport and acknowledgement of different calendars. Also, there's a general pressure in academia to move fast, right? From data collection to analysis to dissemination into those academic products that is often our currency in this type of system. Which is why a lot of feminist scholars urge for the research process to slow down, to reflect, to iterate, and to think about impact, not only at the end, but embedding that in all of your research methods and practices. So Jody, can we now reflect with you on a community-based project that you'd like to share with us? I think having an example of work is the best way to teach folks, to bring them into our world, and to talk about both, opportunities and challenges of this.
Sure. So what comes to mind for me, and I would actually classify this project as truly community engaged work. And I think, it's been an ongoing project. I was not the one to start this project. I came to this work a couple of years into, but I wanted to just highlight this project called Basta, which means enough in Spanish. The name actually is derived from the farm workers who catalyzed this work. And Basta has developed not just from a training and a curriculum that we co-developed with a broad swath of stakeholders that I'll talk about in a minute, but it's actually also now a coalition in Washington State, the Basta Coalition, with the goal of preventing and addressing sexual harassment in agriculture. So this work really started over a decade ago, before Me Too had really grown and came to our public consciousness. But I think as we go along, we'll kind of parse out some of the key aspects of this project, I think will be helpful in talking about what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think before we dive in, Jody, I think it would be helpful to learn about how the focus came about. So how do you prioritize different community needs when there's obviously so much going on at the same time? And some of this happened during the pandemic as well. So there was a lot of pivoting. But specifically the focus on sexual harassment, how was that kind of discussed and agreed upon in community?
Yeah. Well, it was really, this particular project was truly catalyzed, and it continues to be driven by farm workers, and particularly Latino farm workers in Eastern Washington. And so it really started with my former colleague, Dr. Victoria Beckwith Vasquez, who was at the time the director of community engagement and outreach at the Pacific Northwest Agricultural Safety and Health Center, PNASH, was doing work in Eastern Washington. And PNASH provides a lot of different trainings relating to, heat, pesticide drift, and such. And in doing that work, there was a group of farm workers, women, who really brought to Dr. Vasquez's attention that, these trainings are great, but they continually go to work and feel afraid of the harassment that they're feeling, that none of these other safety trainings really matter. And so, and when I talk about harassment, I want to just fit it within the broad spectrum of sexual violence. So it could be anything from persistent, sexual comments in nature, to asking for sexual favors, to actual sexual assault. So, sexual harassment, and there's been little but growing research on this issue, and we've been a part of that contribution. It's hard to study because we know it's also underreported, and people are afraid to talk about it for good reason. But it's very endemic within agriculture. It's across all sectors, and I know I'm not making any friends in that community talking and calling it out, but because of the factors that are, part of agriculture, the isolation of the work, workers who are also feeling perhaps intimidated from the power dynamics. It's very hierarchical, and also issues like gender imbalance. About 75% of the agricultural workforce is male identifying farm workers, and also issues of relating to perhaps immigration status. Those are factors that influence how it continues in agriculture. Something else I think that's important to put out there too is that in other sectors, sexual harassment training is required by law, but in agriculture it is not. And it's really dealt with at the state level. So we have states like California that have, through the unions, have passed legislation to make it a requirement, but in Washington state it is not a requirement. So these group of women were basically saying, hey, we need to develop a training here. We need to have a training here. And so that really started the project. But it grew from there. So from there came an advisory group that was formed by Dr. Beckwith Vasquez and a large group of stakeholders from not just farm workers, but also human rights advocates, legislators like the former Representative Phyllis Kenney. We had legal experts, organizations like Legal Voice, Northwest Justice Project, Human Rights, Washington Human Rights Commission, Oxfam. All of them were interested parties in forming this advisory group, which is now the Boston Coalition. But we realized that we really needed to listen. We needed to learn more about what was going on. So when we're talking about listening, it was deep. It was a couple of years of interviews and focus groups and community forums, and not just with farm workers, but also with growers and employers and some of these legal advocates, to truly try to get a 360 of what was going on. And so from this advisory group, there was it was decided that the ultimate goal was to create we always knew policy was going to be first and forefront, but just in terms of immediate needs, it was needing to have a tailored training, not just in Spanish and in English, but also at different levels. So for workers, for supervisors, for growers, and through some of the preliminary work, what we realized is that many people had misconceptions about what sexual harassment was. And also employers were not necessarily understanding what was going on. And there wasn't processes on what happens when this was happening. Then we also had some major lawsuits happen during this time. So this is an example of how history can impact your research and history can impact the work that you do. So we had some major lawsuits, settlements. One was led by our Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. It was a dairy industry. It was a big sexual harassment case that started to spark attention from the agricultural community, growers, but also Me Too in 2017. So in some of these discussions that we had initially, not everybody wanted to come to the table, and there was some adversarial feelings there. But after Me Too and Tarana Burke and all of that great work, there was a heightened sense of, we better look at this more closely. But farm workers were still being left out of that conversation, right? So Dr. Vasquez, along with Representative Kenny and Lupe Balboa, I should say, from the Washington Farm Workers Union, wrote an op-ed called, Where are the Farm Workers and Me Too?
Yeah.
So that led to additional heightened journal articles and publicity from the popular press. Our students actually at UW were working collectively to create a social marketing campaign. And that brought more people into this work. And it also brought resources. So we were able to get some resources that helped to create these tailored materials. One of which is, the biggest piece of that is this video. And
So I do want to point out that you spent a lot of time on site for this project, right? I think that we had an image there. So just kind of, making sure that labor for yourself and your collaborators is not invisible. I want us to spend some time on this photo and for you to tell us a little bit about that sustained engagement and commitment that you made to this group.
This was really, I think, kind of the ultimate of, it took about 6 years to get to this point. And through those dialogues with farm workers and this group that I told you that started up, Proyecto Buenestar, a group of farm worker women who were like wanting to write stories. And initially it started with audio, radio novellas that were played from radio station KDNA in Granger, Washington. And then they wanted to create wallet cards. So these ideas came from them. What can we do out in the fields? And as women, and forming this connection of helping other women, wallet cards emerged. And then this idea of having this video. And the video was, it's really a story that's sort of a collection of other stories about Juana and experiences that she has in the workplace and the importance of bystanders. So you can see the entire video that's on the Panache website for free. But in this trailer, what you'll see is you'll see some of the farm workers that were initially part of the advisory group. You'll see legislators, you'll see Dr. Brooke Vasquez. This is sort of the penultimate of the work, being able to come together and create this resource.
Do we want to let our audience know this video is about 1.5 minutes long? And it might be triggering for folks.
Yeah, definitely. Please. We know that statistically that there 1 out of 3 women, and this is underreported, are going to experience some form of sexual violence. This is not limited to women, by the way. It's all genders, but it is a very difficult topic. So please do, as Carmen said, take care in the next minute or so while this plays. Do what you need to do.
He sido acosada sexualmente.
Lo sufrí tanto en bodegas como en el field.
There's hostile stares, there's name calling, bullying of a sexual nature. It runs the gamut from something that people think of as extreme flirtation to rape in the workplace.
Hasta uno no se siente seguro en la área de trabajo.
It's often a very hidden problem. It often goes unreported.
Because it's usually a supervisor or somebody higher up in the ladder than the farm worker working in the fields.
It's like a cancer to your business in the long run.
There's a lot of risks for women in agriculture, being that it's a male-dominated industry.
Es triste, es duro, te enfermas, a veces ya no quieres ir a trabajar.
No one should have to dread coming to work.
El acoso sexual es un problema grande que afecta a todos los que los hemos vivido.
It's illegal under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Not just a civil rights problem, but a human rights problem.
That's why it's important for employers to do sexual harassment training, to avoid bad situations and all the costs that go with it.
Tenemos que parar esto, lo tenemos que parar, ya basta.
And the name for this project also actually came from Carmen. That was Carmen. Paula. I'm looking at Carmen. Came from Paula. Paula, who had written a poem called Basta, Basta, Basta. And that became the name of this project. And it's now become the name of this coalition in Washington State.
Yeah. Yeah, Jody, I do want to take a minute to kind of acknowledge the sensitive and delicate nature of this type of work, the potential triggering or emotional effect that it has on you as a researcher. So in engaging this work, I know sometimes I have a difficult time knowing if I'm doing enough. I feel personal connections to the folks that I work with. They remind me of my family, of my community. How do you, in these kinds of projects, take care of yourself and check in with how you're feeling?
Yeah, it's I don't have an easy solution for this, you all. I think it is an ongoing, there are days that I felt overwhelmed, and then I'm fueled by, hearing and working with the farm workers that I work with, and the stories of those milestones that we have together fuels me. But I don't think I ever stop feeling that I'm not doing enough. Honestly, it is it can seem very overwhelming, but at the same time, being able to understand that we're definitely aiming for systems level change, but there's work on the ground and the immediate that we need to do. And so it's also about recognizing and celebrating those moments where those good things have happened, putting this in perspective. So there are days where I can't work on it, and I don't. And then I come back to it. So I'm sure there's people out there who can give me advice on this as well. But
yeah, I don't think any of us have figured it out yet, but I think talking about it is a good step. So let's go back to Basta a little bit. What impact have you seen from the project, or what's in store for Basta in the future?
I think, a couple of things I want to highlight here that have been different than other community engaged projects that I've had is bringing growers into this was huge because we really needed to have that. We don't have to have them all. We just have to have some. And they're modeling change within agriculture, and bringing more women growers into this work too, who are establishing workplaces of safety and community. And as we talk about feminist, values is really important. So I think I first and foremost want to say the stakeholders that we have and have grown over time have really helped in the sustainability and the richness of this work. And so, having that group that's just growing has enabled us to do more and do more together. And it was really about trust. We weren't sure how it was going to go, like having growers in the same room as farm workers. So it's more than just coming to this project. It's other things that they're doing in their workplaces. And we're actually starting to study this from more of a workplace climate, because it's not just sexual harassment, it's other forms of harassment and labor injustice. So it's dealing with all of these other things, and sexual harassment and sexual violence are also an outcome of some of those things. So it's about changing culture. But in terms of impact, since this work, we've been, there's thousands of people who have been able to use this work on their work site. We're now in the formative evaluation stage where we're actually being able to partner and just to look at what some of the immediate but long-term impacts are. But providing resources, so like beyond the video, we have scenarios. So this, training, we looked at how training is usually done in sexual harassment, and we all know that it's failing. We really emphasize, and this is huge for agriculture, taking time to have, 90 minutes to 2 hours of talking about scenarios and these issues in a deeper way than has been done. It's not always realistic, but it's important. So we have a variety of different resources that can be used, posters, all of this coming from farm workers and the comment.
Yeah, and these are great examples of, when we think about kind of non-traditional products, let's say outputs, deliverables. Often I talk with my students about how, it's not always necessarily the journal article, the book chapter, the dissertation even, that is the only way to translate research into practice. So I think these are really great tangible examples for everyone. You've also formed, you mentioned the coalition, right, which is kind of like next steps for BASTA, which is impacting at the policy level. Usually policy level is the hardest level to get to for our work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was really simultaneous to that. It's an important driver because, again, we can create, education is a big piece of that. But without a systems policy change, that's where it's like really big movement can happen. And I want to credit Dr. Barkov-Vasquez for really championing the BASTA Coalition. And now the BASTA Coalition is actually being led by one of the students that was involved early on in this work, Isabel Reyes-Paz, who's, and it's become now, it's heading toward also a nonprofit organization. So, yeah.
That's great. And you mentioned a comic. I just want to make sure we get to that.
I want to thank CCDE for this. So, farm workers were talking about how, in addition to workplace education, they wanted to have a resource that they could share all over in the community and spark dialogue about it. So this idea of having a comic surfaced, and we were able to get a seed grant from the CCDE and work with a Latina artist, Myra Lara, who this happened during the pandemic, by the way. Mm-hmm. So it was coming together on Zoom and even on phones. And I remember there were days where Mara was screen copying, things and pages and sending it to people and on their phones. And the people that are actually in this comic are part of represent some of the people that have been involved in this work. So like, for example, the narrator is actually one of our key, catalysts and drivers, Paula, who continues on.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think this is a great example of, again, meeting folks where they are, producing things that are accessible. And so this was part of the CCDE small grants program that we have. In this particular one, it was focused on health equity, and we encourage folks in the university to partner with community leaders, community organizers, nonprofit organizations to think about how they can do engaged health equity work. And that's exactly the type of work that the lab is going to continue supporting and highlighting and promoting. There's so much of this work that's happening across the University of Washington and across other kind of groups and institutions, that the more that we support it and institutionalize it, the more resources we would get for this type of work. So we are going to wrap up with a brief conversation about advice for students and researchers who want to engage more meaningfully with communities outside the university. And then we'll get to some questions from the audience. So Jody, any advice that you have for folks who are maybe just, thinking about doing more engaged work or deep in it and wanting to make sure that their work is impactful and meaningful?
Yeah. Well, first thing that coming from a health background, what I always think about is the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. So, why are we wanting to engage in this work? And that's an important question to ask. For whose benefit are we doing this? And also taking the time to being reflexive and examine our own positionality to the issues, because we may not be the best person to be doing that work, even with people. So we have to have those questions. I think we have to mull those over from the very beginning. But I think that trust is a really key piece. And so, what is the work that you're doing in the communities? What are the partnerships that you're already starting to engage in? Building those relationships, I think, are important from the very onset. What do you think, Carmen? What are some of the things that come to mind for you as you give advice?
Yeah, so I think, connecting with each other. Sometimes students feel maybe a little overwhelmed by a more engaged research process, don't know how to initiate relationships with folks in the community. Where do they start? How do they approach them? So the more that we bring in students and collaborators, especially working interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary way, we can share those resources with each other, not reinvent the wheel, protect our community connections, but also leverage the expertise at the university that a lot of us have, the resources and the skills that can make a big difference outside of the university.
Yeah, I think that reciprocity is also something to keep in mind, and that's what I go back to. What are the goals from the very start? Co-creating those together.
Right. Yeah, with the co-creation of knowledge as the ultimate goal. Okay, so we can go on forever, but let's see if we have a couple of questions from the audience. We have Dr. Townsell in the audience. Dr. Townsell is my colleague in the Department of Communication. She asked, can you talk more about the personal costs of doing this urgent, disruptive work? Thank you for using the word disruptive. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Does this work and the resistance you face take an emotional toll? How do you manage that? Yes, and yes.
I think, it goes back to community too, because I couldn't do this work alone and I couldn't keep going by myself. And there's times where, partners in this work, we do struggle with this at different times. And that's when I can say, okay, maybe there's handing it off to someone for a little bit to do this work. So understanding that we all need to take a pause and we all need to have those spaces sometimes where we give ourselves to restore and renew, because it's hard. And we really got to think about the long game in all of this, which, let's just be honest, that's a lot of reasons why people don't engage in this work, or they get tired and they get burned out. And it's easier. And I am not by any means judging this, but I'm just saying it's running a secondary data analysis is quite different than doing this work. And so it's important. And there's maybe we need to switch it up a little bit, because we have to give those moments to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. And I think knowing, our usual thing is knowing when to say no, or when we're giving too much of ourselves in too many different spaces, and focusing that energy a little bit in a more concentrated way might be better in the long run. And professionally, I would say, Dr. Townsell, we are actually fortunate that, at least in our department and at the University of Washington, more of this research is being recognized toward our tenure and promotion, thinking about merit and thinking about the way that our scholarship is valued. So I think those are steps in the right direction professionally to support researchers in being able to do more of this without sacrificing, professional goals.
Yeah. And I just want to say that's a big reason why I'm here, especially on my campus, where in my school, we value the Boyer model, which looks at scholarship in different ways, and application is key scholarship. That means working in community in the service that we do beyond just the peer-reviewed articles or presentations. So I'm very grateful for that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, we have one more question. Mercy is an incoming graduate student in our Department of Communication next year. Yay. We're excited to have her. She asks, what are you most excited about working on in HEAL? Are there particular projects you're looking forward to starting or continuing? Great question, Mercy, because you might be working on some of these projects. So we have kind of a lot of projects that are focusing on things like resilience, resistance through resilience that are part of the Interrupting Privilege program, thinking about reflecting on the experience of communities of color during the pandemic. So all of these projects will continue to support through the center and the lab. There's projects on kind of thinking about mental health in vulnerable communities, thinking about experiences of trauma, and bridging those relationships with folks who are really healing after a tumultuous couple years, and researchers too who are trying to come back to in-person engaged opportunities and activities. So that's really what we're most excited about, is to return to a little bit of a hybrid model of engaging in ways that makes everyone feel comfortable. And we can address so many different aspects of health equity in that way and reach more folks. One example of a community event that is returning to in-person is MindFest. Do you want to tell us about that, Jody?
Sure. So MindFest May is Mental Health Awareness Month. MindFest is actually a large 5-county community event. It's a mental health arts festival with the goal of bringing diverse communities together to reduce stigma and sparking dialogue about mental health. So this is another project that I'm involved with. It's the program is called Mental Health Matters of Washington, and we use an intersectional, intergenerational, and cross-cultural approach to talk about mental health and to address many of the barriers in terms of early intervention, as well as striving for reducing suicides, but also specifically prioritizing communities of color and other marginalized communities. So MindFest brings together, it reminds us that mental health is not just about mental illness, it's also about joy, it's about thriving, it's about learning, it's about being in community. So we'll have a lot of interactive workshops, from sound baths to drumming to dancing, art, and speakers. So there's an eclectic mix of a lot of things. So we encourage you to come.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be there. My students will be there, and we're excited.
Okay, we're sponsoring it.
Yes. We have a couple quick questions from our grad student and one of our producers, Laura Irwin. How do you recommend initiating communication and relationships with community partners? It's a great question. So one quick tip, Jody.
Yeah, one quick tip is, first of all, get involved with some of the groups in your community, build those networks. But also, I wanted to say that you have an advantage being a student. When people, I've seen this time and time again, approaching with humility and being a student can open a lot of doors for you. What would you say, Carmen?
Yeah, just putting yourself out there. I know we all have limited time, but now that there's more community events, going to them, volunteering your time as much as possible, making connections, and reaching out to us, to faculty, to folks who are kind of already doing that and kind of trying to join projects that exist already would be great. Okay, one final question before we wrap up. Dr. Joseph, how should and can community engaged scholarship shape graduate curriculum in all classes? Yes.
I want to hear this from you, Carmen. Since you're leading a seminar on this, please tell.
Yeah. So I have my seminar at the graduate level, which was not a hard sell for our department or for the university. It's a very welcoming space for this. There are also a lot of community-based participatory research courses throughout the campus. There's some in social work, some in public health. But I would say it's being just very intentional about it's pretty, I would say, not a lot of heavy lifting to add a module on community engagement into most methods courses, especially, right? When we talk about methods, there's so many resources to just apply that to an engaged context. But also just investment from the institution in wanting graduate students to have this type of kind of real world experience, experience doing things like this, producing things that are a little bit non-traditional in the academic sense, going to community events, tabling, doing exhibits, interviewing folks in community settings. That should be packaged as the graduate education model for the future, also to make our graduate students prepared for different types of careers. So yes, there should be a commitment to this. And I will say at the CCDE, we've developed an undergraduate course on engaged scholarship that we were running in the summers, trying to bring back this summer. So this has been happening. I think it just has to be recognized and then scaffolded in a way that reaches more students. That's my soapbox.
I was going to say, it's also a great reminder of why we're here and who is our work benefiting? Who's the university at large benefiting? If not for communities, we can't directly apply it into action. So
yeah. Oh, these are some of my students commenting. They're excited to be at MindFest this weekend. They're developing this amazing interactive exhibit where folks talk about what mental health or wellness means to them as we're thinking about some of these, health equity concerns. So I do want to thank my students, but especially I want to thank our producers for the show, Jody, who did a great job, right? So we have Josh Griffin, our program manager, grad students, especially Julie Fang and Laura Irwin, who did all of the promo, all of the design, and are backstage right now producing the show. We would not have been able to do this without them. They coached us and developed everything for so far for the lab, and will continue to make decisions for the lab based on what they want to see as well. So stay tuned, much more coming with HEAL, and follow the CCDE on Instagram and Twitter to stay updated. Our new virtual space is coming soon. But thank you so much for being here with us. If you're watching it recorded, I hope this is useful in classes or in any other settings. Yeah, and thank you for being here with me, Jody. This was such a treat.
Thank you for having me. Excited for all of these things happening. So thanks.
Definitely, and I'll see you at MindFest.
Will do. Hope to see you all there too.
Bye, everyone.